session, but before I do have sort of something I want to share in terms of introducing myself before I do. So when I was a master's student back in 2018 in South Korea, submitting 20 or so applications to various PhD programs in the US, I asked Professor Sung-Hong Won, whose class on Milton played a big role in my interest in the poet, what university would be the best for someone interested in Milton. Without hesitation, he told me to go to Notre Dame. I would later learn why he said that. I learned that Professor Sung-Hong Won was Steve's first graduate student here at Notre Dame. So today is also a very special day for me as well, as one of Steve's last students. So it's sort of come full circle. So I'm very happy to be here introducing our wonderful speakers. Our first speaker, John Rumrich, is Ceylonese Centennial Professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin. He has also taught in South Africa, Ireland, France, and China. A persistent writer and editor, he published Milton Unbound with Cambridge University Press in 1996, and in 1987, Matter of Glory, a new preface to Paradise Lost with the University of Pittsburgh Press. In 1998, with Stephen B. Dobransky, he co-edited Milton and Heresy, which won the Irene Samuel Award for Best Collection / Edition. Moreover, he co-edited the complete poetry and major prose works of John Milton with William Kerrigan and Steve Fallon, the best edition of Milton out there, by the way, I think. Again, in 2018, with Steve Fallon, John Rumrich co-edited Immortality and the Body and the Age of Milton, published by Cambridge University Press. He has also published a variety of book chapters and articles on Milton and early modern literary culture. John and Steve have shared friendship and ideas since meeting 25 years ago as grad students at the University of Virginia. But I think...
No, it was 25.
No, I think, Steve, that's a typo on your part, but we'll keep it at 25 years. Please welcome John to the stage.
Okay. This is a talk that I've given before, well, substantially, but I've revised it a lot. Oh, you want me to talk louder? Microphone. Just click it up. Can you hear better? No? Higher? Like right there? Yeah. Now we're good? Yeah. Yeah. That sounds like the voice of God. So it's substantially a talk that I've given before, but I'm trying to publish it. So I'm revisiting the topic, and it was from the time before COVID, so I kind of lost it, and now I'm trying to resuscitate it. The alternative was to do a talk based on something I've written for a collection that Rachel is putting together. But that would have bored her to tears because she's been all over that thing. So at least you guys aren't that familiar with it. The humanistic aversion to determinism, however pertinent it may be to our understanding of Milton's anxious psychology, misses the point of his persistent arguments for free will. As the wonderfully lucid Dennis Danielson amply demonstrated in his classic study, Milton's Good God, the prime purpose of Milton's dogged anti-Calvinist arguments is not to insist on the dignity of the human subject, but to defend God. That shouldn't be there. The cause of eternal punishment, he insists in his theological treatise, Christian Doctrine, quote, must, if it is to be just, be man's sin alone, not God's will. In that same treatise, Milton answers the difficult logical challenge that his assertion of free will presents by positing a divine omnipotence sufficient both to ordain a space for human liberty and yet preserve God's omniscient authority over everything that occurs. Quote, God's will is no less the first cause of everything if he decrees that certain things shall depend upon the will of man than if he has decreed to make all things inevitable, unquote. For the Arminian Milton, because God is good, he must play dice with the universe, even though as he rolls them, he knows with absolute certainty what numbers will come up. And if I understand Milton's chaos correctly, this theological commitment to indeterminacy is as systematic and universal as Einstein's was to determinism. In the cosmos imagined by Milton, as in quantum mechanics, the potency for otherness constitutes the material fabric of existence at its most basic level. As the plot of Paradise Lost unfolds, the narrator reminds readers that things could happen otherwise than they do, even though they unfold precisely as God foresees they will. Returning again to Christian doctrine, we see that Milton energetically defending and then summarizing this double-edged case for contingency. I think here we do have a slide. And I've gone ahead and formatted it. So the three different possibilities: either God determines it completely, or he makes your nature such that you must sin, or, and that's the most important one, and I put it in red just in case you couldn't tell, if God is the joint cause, if he insists. John Kerry's translation of the phrase integrama libertate as absolutely unimpaired freedom may be meant to evoke Milton's epic action, especially Satan's sense of impairment at the time of his fall. Etymologically, however, the meaning of the superlative adjective integrima derives from the verb tangere, to touch. A more literal translation would be utterly untouched freedom. God himself chooses this verb when he insists that he has done nothing to necessitate humanity's fall, or, quote, touch with lightest moment of impulse his free will, unquote. The standard of utterly untouched freedom, barring even the lightest moment of impulse from disturbing the inertial guidance of free volition, admits no qualification or mitigation of autonomous agency, as Milton exhaustively elaborates in his chapter on divine decree. The standard of joint cause, even the somewhat mitigated necessity that would occur if God were to assist free agents when willing, thus becoming the joint cause, is rejected. The standard of joint cause presents Milton with the greatest challenge as theologian and poet of Theodicy, one that I have come to think he does not address successfully. Perhaps no theologian with a serious commitment to scriptural fidelity could. The distinction between absolute foreknowledge and causation articulated in chapters 3 and 4 of Christian doctrine may be tenable in principle. But once the account of divine providence given in chapter 8 is taken into account, it simply does not hold up. In that chapter, Milton concedes with uncharacteristic awkwardness that that he must introduce the topic of sin well before its proper place in his treatise. I'll let you read that rather than read it to you. As you can see, the sentence structure mimics the organizational disruption as Milton begins his sentence with in peccatis, in sins, before parenthetically digressing with strained wit about the permitted intrusion of sin into a chapter on divine providence. He then repeats in peccatis and observes that Scripture records the overt and forceful involvement of God's providence in sin, quote, not just by permitting it or else withdrawing his grace, but also by frequently urging sinners on to commit sin, by hardening and by blinding them. Subsequent passages in this chapter mitigate this blunt statement. mitigate it to the point of contradiction. So, for example, Milton will stipulate that in punishing sinners with sin, quote, he does not do that by forcing anyone to sin or by assisting him, but by withdrawing his wonted grace of enlightenment and his aid against sins. In other places in the same chapter, he must resort to begging the question, quote, in these and very many other passages of both Testaments, although God openly proclaims that it is he himself who urges the sinners on, who hardens him, who afflicts him with blindness, and who incites him into delusion, nevertheless, he must not for that reason, most holy as he is, be called the author of even the smallest sin. This is the hermeneutic get-out-of-jail-free card or executive privilege included in Milton's unique theory of scriptural accommodation. Although as readers of Scripture we must, Milton insists, submit to its account of God and not try to pretty it up, we must not do so to the extent where what is written about God, or rather what God has caused to be written about himself, undermines our faith in his moral perfection. God's goodness is holy and therefore must not be charged with causing sin, regardless of repeated scriptural testimony to the contrary. That would be a violation of his holiness. Hale and Cullington, in their excellent edition of Milton's treatise, note the incompatibility between the utter holiness axiomatically attributed to God and the Scripture, and the scriptural record of God's instigation of sin with which Milton wrestles. And here I quote them, the difficult reconciliation is essayed, they claim, by separating act from motive. When Scripture represents God as pushing creatures to sin, we should remember that he does so for providentially good reasons, including punishment of the wicked. Yet such a separation of action and intention seems too Machiavellian to preserve God's pristine holiness. In the first third of Paradise Lost, divine providence first allows God's broken and shackled adversary to revive, then loses chains, then conceive a plan targeting humanity that would have been inconceivable except for leaked information or ancient and prophetic fame, rather, than to escape from hell with perplexing allegorical assistance of sin and death, and ultimately traverse chaos and find its way with Uriel's assistance to Adam and Eve. Divine intervention during Satan's journey from hell to paradise is so decisive at key moments in the narrative that it does not seem valid to argue, as Empson, inspired by Shelley, does, that Satan's adversarial persistence against an almighty foe makes him more admirable morally than God. Once Satan rebels against God, he becomes merely his unloved tool, a pathetically self-conscious one, moreover, who explicitly recognizes the impossibility of success, the ever more terrible consequences that will ensue for himself and others, and his utter lack of volitional capacity to veer from the path he once chose, and yet now remains on immutably, no matter how much he may regret it. He describes his incapacity to change direction as a mutual decision, and so it seems to have been originally. Yet once Satan takes the plunge, that is, by the time Abdiel flies away in terror at the end of Book 5, readers cannot rely on statements Satan makes, even in soliloquy, that attribute his behavior to his own agency or leadership. Whether or not we regard Milton's defense of God's providential role in sin as being logically tenable, it is the explicit basis of his epic narrative. From God's point of view, from Milton's point of view, God's ways cannot be justified. God cannot be good unless rational creatures possess free will. Milton's Arminian faith in human liberty insists that we believe things could occur otherwise than they do, even if, given an almighty and omniscient God, events must occur as they do. This might simply be a time paradox, and if readers could assume God's eternal perspective, all objections would dissolve. But narratives unfold in time, by recounting a series of events. As the plot of Milton's epic unfolds inexorably toward its fatal climax, it becomes increasingly difficult not to see Adam and Eve as victims rather than as ingrates whose fault is but their own. The difficulties crop up almost immediately. God himself will not appear in the story for quite some while, though references to him by the narrator and by his tortured enemies occur frequently, if obliquely. Early on, the narrator explains in the language of high Calvinism that Satan's doom reserves him to more wrath. It is the will and high permission of all ruling heaven that unchains the already devastated Satan from his supine stupor on the billowing waves of fire, so that he might heap on himself damnation, as it is put first reflexively, and then again a few more lines later, on himself trouble, confusion, wrath, and vengeance poured, unquote. Subsequent scenes in Book 1, depicting Satan's recovery and adversarial resurgence, provide additional, familiar evidence that Satan, as a damned creature, may do as he wills, but not will what he wills, to paraphrase Schopenhauer's memorable aphorism, quoted and embraced by Einstein. Satan no longer possesses free will, and his adversarial efforts are bolstered by God and tailored to his providential design. We may shrink from the prospect of a deity who both props up and continues to pummel already defeated enemies, incapable of persisting in any kind of opposition on their own. But our modern delicacy need not account against a narrowly defined theodicy that rests on the sufficiency of unfallen humanity freely to obey God. The problems for Milton's theodicy so defined begin only when Satan escapes from God's torture chamber, oubliette, and makes his way to the garden. The episode that I think makes the theodicy untenable occurs late in the narrative inspired obduracy, propelling Satan to hell from paradise, when he successfully invades the most private place in paradise, Adam and Eve's bower. As you will remember, Satan enters into the very person of Eve through her ear, into her vulnerable and unguarded sleeping mind. Alistair Fowler's note on this passage in his much lauded edition of the epic cites a claim that he attributes to William Hunter, that because Satan does not gain access to her reason, but only her fancy, this assault leaves Eve's freedom untouched. As John Leonard has pointed out, however, Fowler's citation of Hunter is inaccurate and misleading. Having sometimes disagreed with Hunter in print, a man who I remember with considerable personal affection, I'm happy to report that contrary to Fowler's characterization, his balanced and discriminating account of early modern views concerning satanic intrusions into the psyche actually represents them as being quite ominous. What sort of defense is it, after all, to maintain, as Fowler does, that Eve remains untouched because Satan is allowed to poison her imagination only? True enough, when reason returns to duty upon Eve's awakening, she rejects the evil entertained in her dream. This reassures her spouse. Yet, a troubled Adam also observes that this dream of evil could not have originated in Eve herself, because she is created pure. Adam's assertion weighs heavily against Stanley Fish's argument that the narrator's use of the participle assaying and subsequent conditional constructions cast doubt on the success of Satan's attempt to forge a dream. Yet, if Eve herself generates the evil impulse acted out in the dream, Adam's assertion of her natural constitutional purity is mistaken, and her creator shares responsibility for any sin she subsequently commits, a conclusion directly contrary to Fish's main thesis. Fish's doubts about Satan's role in forging the dream also fails to register that Eve's account of the dream begins with her saying, "Methought close at mine ear," one called me forth, exactly repeating the narrator's previous phrasing of Satan's proximity. Nor should we doubt Satan's responsibility for the dream on the ground that he roams out of earshot for conversational details featured in it. If this were true, it would only mean that some of the forged dream's contents does derive from Eve's own mind, rather than solely from the intelligence that Satan has previously gathered. But the notion that Satan is out of earshot appears impossibly strained in context. We learn in this very same book of the epic that Uriel can spot untoward facial expressions at a distance of about 93 million miles. And though Uriel's sight may be sharper than any other spirit's, it seems unreasonable to suppose that any angel, when all ear, in the process of gathering intelligence, would not enjoy superhuman auditory powers capable of hearing voices anywhere within the narrow circuit of the garden. Adam hits the main point. Absent some malignant external influence, unfallen Eve simply cannot dream the dream she reports, or awaken in fear with tears of remorse in her eyes. The only plausible uncertainty admitted by the narrative is, as Catherine Cox has detailed in her brilliant article on this scene, whether Satan manipulates Eve's imagination directly, as if he were playing a pipe organ, or merely inspires venom to taint her animal spirits. Professor Fish proceeds to compare sleeping Eve, assuming for the nonce that she really is dreaming under the spell of Satan, to the wrapped lady in the mask. He then cites the lady's brave insistence that Conus canst not touch the freedom of her mind, even if he has manacled her corporal rind. Should not the fit reader perceive that unconscious Eve's situation differs rather strikingly from the lady's? The lady, while wide awake and glued to her seat, consciously denies her explicitly recognized tempter's ability to do what the unrecognized Satan accomplishes by way of a dream while physically intruding on the sleeping Eve, that is, touch the freedom of her mind. In my view, therefore, Milton's description of Eve's efforts does not permit us to join Fowler and Adam in their confidence that the impact of Satan's infiltration extends only to the fanciful phenomenon of the dream. If Satan successfully taints Eve's animal spirits, which the narrator's diction implies is the easier feat to accomplish, the psychological consequences for Eve would extend to, quote, at least distempered, discontented thoughts, vain hopes, vain aims, inordinate desires, blown up with high conceits, engendering pride, unquote. The half-life of satanic venom in animal spirits is unknown to me, but these spirits, as Raphael confirms, participate in the aspirational process that the illuminating Stephen M. Fallon, a critic I much admire, was first to notice. They produce spirits intellectual of fancy and understanding. The gradual scale of sublimation expressed in these persistently enjambed lines does not, as Lee Morrissey has observed, admit the compartmentalization of psychological faculties endorsed by Adam earlier in the poem. Tainted animal spirits will ultimately become tainted thoughts. Fowler and Hunter's understanding of Eve's dream depends on dualist traditions that distinguish body from spirit on ontological grounds and privilege the immortal rational soul as being transcendent. The vitalist moralist Milton rejects these traditions. The notion that the impact of Satan's assault on Eve could be limited to her fancy, especially if the assault produces envenomed animal spirits, cannot be reconciled with the accounts of the human psyche offered by Raphael only a few hours after Eve's dream is recounted. By the time Satan has been apprehended, the mission of the angelic guard, quote, to keep this place inviolable and these from harm, unquote, has failed. The garden has been violated, and unsuspecting Eve has been physically contaminated and psychologically assaulted while bereft of rational defense. Even worse, she and Adam both remain entirely unaware of their altered condition, of her altered condition. When God orders Raphael to warn Adam and Eve that Satan is plotting against them, he does not ask the smiling spirit to identify God's hardened adversary as the perpetrator of Eve's otherwise impossible dream. It would require no artful accommodation to report that Satan's obdurate plotting has advanced to such an extent that Eve was a victim of auricular assault while she slept. The God whom Milton sets out to justify is vulnerable to the complaints he lodges against the Calvinist doctrine of an almighty creator who punishes his creatures for the sins they necessarily commit. Or so it seems if we apply Milton's own stringent standards regarding the impact of necessity on freedom. Foreknowledge itself may have no effect on the object foreseen. I can agree with that. But the events foreseen by God take shape in conformity to the pervasive influence of his eternal providence, the very providence that Milton asserts to the height of his great argument. What God immutably foresees, he also providentially arranges to occur. It is in the leeway that Milton allows providential intervention to undermine free will that Milton concedes more to Calvin than has been generally recognized. Specifically, in the case of sin, God, as Milton says, quote, in his capacity as chief overseer of things, bends and steers in this direction perhaps, or in that, at this or that objective, unquote. What has been immutably foreseen will inevitably transpire regardless of the sphere of human volitional agency that, theoretically, is cordoned off from divine interference. Milton's epic narrative cannot be described as determinist in the Calvinist sense, but it seems to me to anticipate a kind of storytelling associated with noir detective mysteries. The most pertinent resemblance is that, as in conspiracy theories, the narrative is predicated on a totalizing, somewhat intelligible, but largely unperceived power, controlling events in its own interest, no matter how one struggles against it. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. I actually have that. It's something that I like, but I don't think it'll play. Anyway. He says that. You could do it, couldn't you? But it's only a sentence, and he does say it, so. Sam.
Thank you, John. Our second speaker, Samuel Fallon, has been an assistant professor of English at the State University of New York at Geneseo since 2018. Before this, he was at Wesleyan University and the State University of New York at New Paltz as a visiting assistant professor. In 2019, Samuel Fallon published his first book, Paper Monsters, Persona and Literary Culture in Elizabethan England, with the University of Pennsylvania Press. In this book, he explores the role of a new species of textual being, the serial, semi-fictional persona, and the formation of English literary culture at the turn of the 17th century. He works widely on early modern literature and has published numerous articles on writers from Sidney and Shakespeare to Milton and Anne Bradstreet. He is currently working on a book on literary character, provisionally titled One of a Kind, Character and Abstraction from Spenser to Milton. Our speaker, whom Steve has known for Sam's lifetime, more than 25 years, right, is well on his way to surpassing his father as a scholar. And that last line was from Steve, specifically told me to add that in there. Please welcome Sam with a round of applause.
You're in trouble for augmenting the bio, but it's true that we go way back, and I'm really sort of pleased. One of the sort of privileges of being an early modernist is that I've been able to understand my father's incredible achievements in a way that children rarely get to, and I'm able to be part of this today. I'm very grateful for that. So without further preamble, and I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm not going to worry about the computer screen. I will dive into it. Everyone can hear me all right?
Yeah.
In the final lines of Paradise Regained, having been sung victor by the angels and hailed son of the Most High, Jesus does something that has always puzzled readers of Milton's brief epic. He goes home. Home is a strange place to go at the end of a poem whose aim has seemingly been to lead him into his public career. It's stranger still that, having revolved for 4 books the question of what it might mean to be the Son of God, the poem would conclude by restoring him to his human position. For in going home, Jesus goes back to the parent whom he has come to seem ready to leave behind. As Milton puts it, tersely but not without sentiment, quote, he unobserved home to his mother's house private returned. Jorge Luis Borges, as I learned from an article on these lines by Marjorie O'Rourke Boyle, found them ridiculous, a reduction of the son to, quote, an English gentleman in a bowler hat coming home to his monk for tea. Borges included them in a list he kept of bad lines by great poets. Maybe the lines are as bad as Borges thought, but I would be willing to defend them in their prosaic modesty, their turn from the cosmic to the domestic. There's something that recalls the wandering steps and slow with which Adam and Eve in Milton's earlier and greater poem leave paradise. I begin with these lines, however, not in order to mount a defense, but because I take them to mark out a central concern not only of Paradise Regained, but also of Samson Agonistes, the tragedy with which Milton's poem was, of course, published in 1671. Samson, too, ends with a homecoming. After the slaughter of the Temple of Dagon, Manoah arranges for the return of his son's body, attended, quote, with silent obsequy and funeral train home to his father's house. There, Manoah declares, will I build him a monument and plant it round with shade of laurel evergreen and branching palm. Like the son, Samson will finally find his way back to his childhood home, back to a human parent. Milton's conclusion is in keeping with the end of Samson's story in the book of Judges. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the burying place of Manoah, his father. But in certain respects, Milton departs from the biblical narrative. The reference to Manoah's burying place seems to indicate that he had died before Samson, and even if we take the biblical Manoah to survive his son, he doesn't figure into the account of Samson's imprisonment or of his self-annihilation. His attempt to persuade his son to come home and then to free him by ransom, all of that is Milton's invention. And as an invention, it hasn't always been well reviewed. Critics have found Manoah sententious and ridiculous at best, a father unable to grasp the depths of his son's crisis, at worst, a temptation to despair and an obstacle to regeneration. It's no surprise that Manoah's fixation on the most prosaic of solutions, redemption by money rather than grace, would strike readers as absurd. Like the son's return to the mother's home in Paradise Regained, Manoah's attempt to ransom his son has the feel of a category error. Doesn't he know what kind of story he's in? But perhaps what's touching about Manoah is just the fact that he doesn't know. His love is so single-minded that even the claims of Samson's divine calling can't distract or deter it. The pain of parental love is nearly the first thing that Manoah observes in the play. When barrenness and wedlock had threatened to deny him a child, he had prayed for one, but finding his son in prison, he laments, "Who would now be a father in my stead?" It's a poignant question, and one framed by ironies of which Manoah may or may not be aware. After all, while it was God who conferred on Manoah the decidedly mixed blessing of fatherhood, it is God who promises to take his place. Such a substitution is the story of Paradise Regained, where the son of Joseph is revealed to be son of God. And it is also the story of Samson Agonistes, where Samson's life acquires meaning by virtue of his having been specially called, bred, as he puts it, as a person separate to God. To be sure, Samson's claim to divine filiation is at every step more troubled and uncertain as the source of the rousing motions that will lead him to the Philistine's temple. But it is also complicated by the inconvenient presence of his human father. Whereas Joseph's place in Paradise Regained is seamlessly taken by God, Samson is a drama determined, in John Guillory's words, by a contradiction between the demands of the poem's two fathers, Yahweh and Manoah. The force of Manoah's question, who would now be a father in my stead, is no doubt ironized by the shadow of this contradiction. Although Manoah may not fathom it, Samson always has another father in mind. Yet Manoah's claim is secured nonetheless by the peculiar character of his love, which he understands as impossible to escape or give up. He can't get out of the role of father. Who would now be a father in my stead? God's special favor may be lost, as Samson feels it has been, but Manoah's paternal attachment has not been elected, and so it cannot be retracted. The curious effect of Milton's insertion of Manoah is thus to put a representation of choiceless love at the center of a tragedy of divine election. And my aim in this paper is to understand what that means. The sense that he is or was subject to a special vocation called by God to some great purpose, is at the heart of Samson's agony. His birth, as he remembers in his opening soliloquy, was twice foretold by an angel. He was marked, quote, for some great act or benefit to Abraham's race, designed for great exploits. Distinguished from the common route, Samson is for the chorus one of those whom God has, quote, solemnly elected with gifts and graces eminently adorned to some great work. Unlike the son in Paradise Regained, whose divine appointment is confirmed by the voice of God and who can laconically endure Satan's temptations, Samson's relation to his calling is always less certain, marked by a strenuous effort to know in what sense he is and will be Israel's great deliverer. And in his garrulous failure, his giving up of God's secret, he faces an exile from divine light that affirms his solemn election by precipitously inverting it. The sense of heaven's desertion is felt the more keenly because, as Samson says of God, quote, I was his nursling once and choice delight, his destined from the womb. Divine desertion for Samson constitutes paradoxical evidence of divine election, even as election becomes the basis of complaint against desertion. As Manoah puts it, quote, alas, methinks whom God hath chosen once to worthiest deeds, if he through frailty err, he should not so o'erwhelm, and as a thrall subject him to so foul indignities. Manoah makes this case near the beginning of his visit to Samson in the Philistine prison, where it has the virtue of allowing Samson, who has been making the same complaint himself, to take on the safer role of God's defender, piously reminding his father to, quote, appoint not heavenly disposition. It makes sense for Manoah to be the voice of skepticism, for doubt is a subject that summons him to the stage. Just are the ways of God and justifiable to men, the chorus had insisted in the moments before Manoah's entrance, only to stumble over a disturbing thought. Quoting at a little length here, unless there be who think not God at all, if any be, they walk obscure, for such doctrine never was their school, but the heart of the fool, and no man therein doctor but himself. The chorus quickly reassures itself, consigning radical doubt to the margins of intellectual history as that which is unthinkable and unrecordable within the tradition of theistic thought. But if atheism is that history's outside, it also turns out to be its imminent form, for, quoting again, more there be who doubt his ways not just, and give the reins to wandering thought, till by their own perplexities involved, they ravel more, still less resolved, but never find self-satisfying solution. The raveling perplexities of the doubter may seem to diminish God's glory, but they're also, of course, the engine of theodicy, the provocation, indeed, for Milton's own constant returns to the project of justification. So if Manoah's complaint locates him within this tradition of doubt, his dialogue with Samson produces another subtler form of perplexity. Surveying his son's failures, he notes their most devastating consequence, that his capture will serve to exalt Dagon, whose feast is to be celebrated by the Philistines that day. So Dagon shall be magnified, as he puts it to Samson, and God, beside whom is no God, compared with idols, disglorified, blasphemed. A moment earlier, Manoah had coaxed Samson into a defense of God, but now he elicits something more interesting, an admission that God needs no champion. He, be sure, will not connive or linger thus provoked, Samson tells his father, but will arise and his great name assert. With more than his usual tact, Manoah draws out the implication that heaven can triumph without the aid of Samson. God, he agrees, will not long defer to vindicate the glory of his name. And then he comes to the point. But for thee, he asks, what shall be done? The question is a troubling one, and so is the practical plan that accompanies it. Manoah has already been to see, quote, some Philistine lords with whom to treat about thy ransom. This is not atheism in the stricter sense of the chorus's earlier speech. Manoah does not persuade Samson to unbelief. What he does propose, however, is in its way more remarkable. He urges his son to separate himself from God. Indeed, Manoah insists that separation has already happened. And while God triumphs alone, Samson will need to consider himself. Quote, thou must not, in the meanwhile, here for God, lie in this miserable, loathsome plight, neglected. To go home would be to give up a sense of divine vocation with the compensatory blessing of an escape from the burden of deliverance. More concretely, of course, it would be to accept one father's care in place of the withdrawn care of another. In the prospect of turning from Yahweh to Manoah, Samson is thus allowed to imagine a release from the demands of theistic history into a private life that we would not be wrong to see as a form of atheism, a way, that is, of thinking not God. If the choice of the natural father heralds of removal from sacred history. There's good reason for it. The very form of that history is the family romance, the substitutive identification with a transcendent father. This was Freud's view, at least. Jewish monotheism, he wrote, was, quote, the religion of the primeval father. And it was shaped at its core by the agonistic love that, for Freud, always belonged to the relation between father and son. The hypothesis at the center of Freud's Moses and monotheism is that the origins of monotheistic history lay in a moment of Oedipal violence, the murder of Moses himself, a crime that was also a repression of the monotheistic idea that Moses had brought with him. Only after a long latency, Freud argued, and with the burden of bad conscience, did this idea take hold again, now guaranteed by all of the ambivalence of the father-son relationship. The emergence of the Hebrew God thus mirrored the development in the individual of the superego, itself, quoting Freud again, the successor and representative of the parent, the source of guilty feeling. And just as the superego urged the renunciation and sublimation of libidinal instincts, so for Freud, the father deity demanded an ever more abstract spirituality, the worship of a dematerialized God, the cultivation of rigorous forms of self-denial. Such an abstracted deity is at the center of Paradise Regained, where Jesus pointedly avoids putting God's saving power to material test, and in Samson Agonistes, where he never speaks. So is the practice of renunciation, realized in the serial scenes of temptation by which Jesus and Samson alike are tested. The reason for this renunciation lay in the reward that monotheism held out, the increase in self-confidence, as Freud put it, that came with the consciousness of being chosen. Chosenness was the reciprocal gift of Yahweh to the people who recognized his singular claim to divinity, and its effect was to express the satisfaction of identification with him. The love conferred on the chosen people elevated and distinguished them. It became a matter of pride. Sublimation and renunciation nurtured this pride as signs of progress in spirituality. They demonstrated the worthiness of the chosen, the superiority that justified God's preferential favor. In this way, the substitution of the father deity for the natural father established a new form of parental love, a love distinguished by virtue of its being a matter of choice, and hence capable of recognizing its object as special and deserving. It is a wish for such recognition that lies behind Samson's description of himself as God's, quote, nursling and choice delight. The phrase places God as a substitute father, also as a substitute mother, as Rachel has argued, but also as a father by choice, a word that here instructively combines two senses. On the one hand, elected, on the other, special or rare. For Samson, God's special favor is, of course, something more than the covenant God has made with the Israelites. He is chosen from among the chosen, selected for the task of deliverance. This conviction of divine appointment no doubt intensifies the egoistic satisfactions of election, but it also begins to press upon the theological difficulties of the doctrine. Samson would seem to be an instance of what Milton and De Doctrina calls special vocation, a choosing and invitation of certain selected individuals, I'm quoting here, more clearly and more insistently than is normal, or of a kind of special election by which he, quote, chooses an individual for some employment, whence they are called elect who are superior to the rest for any reason. This sort of muddy concept of special vocation is a curious Miltonic borrowing, for it seems to reproduce, in an estranged form, Calvin's distinction between general and special election, the former the call to everyone, the latter the grace predestined for a chosen few. This strange borrowing is also a symptomatic one, in that it points up certain tensions in Milton's Arminian soteriology. Milton might insist that grace is offered to all, and that election is at once general and conditional, dependent on the individual's acceptance of that grace. But he was also attracted, as Stephen Fallon has made clear, by the prospect of membership in a group, quoting from Paradise Lost, of course, elect above the rest. In his authoritative treatment of the subject in Milton's Peculiar Grace, Fallon shows how this tension runs through Milton's thinking on the problem of salvation. The Arminian doctrine of resistible grace made it possible to see one's salvation as a matter of merit. The Calvinist doctrine of predestination, by contrast, dismissed free will, but it offered the compensatory comfort of election, of one's having been chosen by God. To reject Calvinist soteriology was to lose this comfort, even if it was to regain the will. Milton's recurrent attempts to imagine a form of peculiar grace face up to the terms of this exchange, and in doing so, they disclose a doctrinally impossible wish to see oneself as simultaneously chosen and justified by merit. Milton, Fallon writes, can have either the self-satisfaction of a self-made spiritual man or the self-satisfaction of the one chosen by God in a manner different from that by which others are chosen, but he cannot have both satisfactions at once. It's easy enough to see that Samson nurtures something of the same wish, the wish, quoting once more, to be elect by both birthright and merit. What may be more surprising is the fact that the tragedy seems to grant this wish, to depict a God whose saving grace is neither elected and unconditional like the Calvinist gods, nor unelected and conditional like the Arminian gods, but instead elected and conditional at once. In the event, however, it's a wish better left ungranted. For Samson has the best, but also the most devastating proof that one could imagine of the conditional status of his election, its retraction. He may have been God's nursling and choice delight, but now Samson laments, he hath cast me off as never known. Samson's grief is in part the grief of guilt and failure, but it's also the grief of rejection and abandonment, of having been first chosen and then disowned. When Manoah visits Samson in prison, it's this reversal that he picks out as unjust. And I'm returning to a passage I quoted a little bit earlier. Manoah says, methinks whom God hath chosen once, he should not so o'erwhelm. Chosenness, he implies, should be once and for all. There is, however, one figure whose commitment is as absolute and permanent as Manoah insists that God's should be. That figure is Manoah himself, whose love, in contrast to Yahweh's, is unconditional, for the simple reason that it wasn't chosen in the first place. If Samsonic Anistes is premised then on the paternal substitution at the heart of monotheism, the play's effect is thus to realize that substitution as a contradiction. And in writing Manoah into the tragedy, over and against the authority of judges, Milton raises the tantalizing possibility of its reversal, of a rejection of the divine father in favor of the natural one. Such a reversal is hinted at in a curious moment during Manoah's visit when, having been chastised for bringing God into ill repute, Samson enters into a confession. Father, he declares with a sudden formality, I do acknowledge and confess that I this honor, I this pomp have brought to Dagon, to God have brought dishonor obloquy, and oped the mouths of idolists and atheists. As Tessie Prackis has recently pointed out, Samson's formula seems to derive from the general confession, the communion rite in the Book of Common Prayer, which begins, Almighty God, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, maker of all things, judge of all men, we acknowledge and bewail our manifold sins and wickedness. But the echo is a strangely altered one. As Prackis observes, the father to whom Samson confesses is not God, but Manoah. It is as if Samson supposes, for just a moment, that the one might grant the pardon that properly belongs to the other. Manoah is no doubt capable of judging his son's sins, and in their colloquy, he shows few scruples about doing so. With a stiffness bordering on pathetic, he declares, quote, I cannot praise thy marriage choices, son, rather approve them not. And he's even more withering on Samson's giving up of God's secret. Quote, of all reproach the most with shame that ever could have befallen thee in thy father's house. Quite apart from his being unable to give the pardon that Samson craves, however, Manoah sees no need for it. When he responds to that confession, he simply disregards it. It's here instead that he affirms God's ability to vindicate himself and turns the conversation to his son's own plight. But for thee, what shall be done? His concern for Samson does not depend on moral approbation, and likewise, his pursuit of a ransom isn't deterred by Samson's refusal. If there's something ridiculous about Manoah, something pathetic, it's realized most fully in this scheme for the deliverance of his son, a plot that seemed to demand a parodic reading. For Joseph Whitreich and John Rogers, Manoah's attempts to purchase Samson's liberty by reducing it to a thuddingly literal form point up the absurdity of the ransom theory of atonement, the doctrine that Christ's death redeemed the debt incurred by human sin. Certainly Manoah's project has the feel of a deflation, a reduction of high theological drama to handshakes and bribes. It's little wonder, of course, that Manoah would take a metaphor literally. He is himself the literal embodiment of the relation that Samson has insistently sought to sublimate, the father whose presence is all too real and concerns all too prosaic. Yet Manoah's literalism, his blithe willingness to evacuate the languages of ransom and deliverance of their salvific force, is the surest sign of his love. In the future he imagines, Samson simply comes home. It shall be my delight, Manoah tells the chorus later, having returned just too late with news of success, to tend his eyes and view him sitting in the house ennobled, with all those high exploits by him achieved. The pathetic deflation of the sublime here modulates into pathos, and the evocation of a scene of far smaller scale, a scene that we, unlike Manoah, know can never happen. The paradox of Manoah's parody, indeed, is that his transacted ransom is the play's signal act of non-transactional love. Samson understands that he owes God a great work, the deliverance that will make good on his elevation as a person separate from God. Manoah, by contrast, wants nothing but his release. His love is fully partial. It is reasonless and arbitrary, an expression of the simple fact of his being Samson's parent, which means that it can't be earned, but also that it can't be lost. It's striking, then, that Manoah's proposal elicits from Samson only despair. I'm going to quote at length here. All otherwise, this is in response to Manoah during his visit to the prison. All otherwise to me, my thoughts portend, that these dark orbs no more shall treat with light, nor the other light of life continue long, but yield to double darkness nigh at hand. So much I feel my genial spirits droop, my hopes all flat. Nature within me seems in all her functions weary of herself, my race of glory run, and race of shame. And I shall shortly be with them that rest. Samson's reference to his dark orbs begins a familiar process of sublimation by metaphor as he glimpses in his blindness the loss of the other light of life and awaits a double darkness. But that sublimation is witnessed in its negation. His spirits drooped, his hopes flat. With Hamlet-like weariness, Samson contemplates the history of his election, the races of glory and shame, and finds death to be their sequel. He pointedly refuses to address the alternative that Manoah has held out to him, the prospect of an unheroic life at home. It's as if he's unable to bear a love that, in its absoluteness, would render him again a child. He cannot bear love when he has no reason to be loved, as Stanley Cavell has argued, not of Hamlet but of Lear. And I'm quoting him here, perhaps because of the helplessness, the passiveness which that implies, which some take for impotence. Because Manoah doesn't insist on Samson's shame, because he claims him anyway, he can't save him from it. As they do for Lear, then, for Samson, love and death go together. Quoting Cavell once more, acknowledging love presents itself to him as an annihilation of himself. Samson, of course, never could go home. The impossibility of his doing so is the burden of the biblical story that Milton inherited. That's why Milton's invention of the Manoah subplot is such a touching and tragic choice. It allows him to see clearly the entailments of his own attachment to the idea of being elective of the rest. Manoah's love can seem to indict God's own, to reveal the limits of a favor that thoroughly instrumentalizes its object, and that can be retracted as easily as it is extended. But unconditional love is just the thing that Samson can't accept, for it would leave him no room to think of himself as deserving to be chosen. Samson thus enacts Milton's wish to be elected by merit, but enacts it in the shape of tragedy. His identification with the Father Deity, his need to be chosen, requires renunciation, and what he renounces above all is Manoah, who is left in the play's final lines to argue himself out of grief. Quote, nothing is here for tears, nothing to wail, or knock the breast. In this way, Milton's two answers to the offered ransom, his anticipation of death on the one hand, and his intuition of God's renewed favor on the other, come to the same thing. They are ways of avoiding Manoah's unchosen and unconditional love. When Samson feels the rousing motions that lead him to the Philistine temple, he predicts that this day will be remarkable in my life by some great act, or of my days the last. The or here makes a distinction that begins to collapse as soon as it's proposed. His great act will be his last. But the irony of Samson's avoidance is that in dying, he returns to Manoah after all. Manoah at last becomes the custodian of his memory, so that Samson's bid for divine approval wins only his human father's praise. Samson hath quit himself like Samson, Manoah declares, and heroically hath finished a life heroic. This famous line affirms Samson's special merit, but it does so with a tautological circularity that I would suggest betrays in spite of itself the reasonless intensity of parental care. Manoah's love doesn't turn on the achievement of the great work. It is simply a consequence of Samson's being Samson. If so, then the curious effect of the tragedy's conclusion is to relinquish the dream of singular election, the dream that, as Fallon has shown, lies in all of its contradictions at the heart of Milton's poetic career, just where the play seems to redeem it. For in Manoah's final speech, as Samson had feared and perhaps wished, the question of his election is dissolved in the eyes of a father who never needed to choose. Thank you. Went to microphone.
Yeah, introduce you real quick. Oh, yes. I just had to grab Paul to exchange the battery for the mic.
Oh, please, yeah, go for it.
An associate professor in the English department at Princeton University, Russ Leo has emerged as a leading voice in early modern British and Dutch intellectual and literary history. He studies early modern literature and philosophy, as well as theory, since the 1940s, paying particular attention to labor and social reproduction, as well as to the long histories of Spinozism and Marxism, psychoanalysis, and other theoretical traditions. The paper today comes from a book manuscript tentatively titled Invisible Colleges, a study of practical and imaginative efforts to develop new forms of community, politics, and exchange between the 1640s and the 1690s. Milton and Spinoza figured prominently, and Leo resituates them in a shared historical milieu, one that begins with the utopian efforts of the Hartleap Circle and moves across the 1650s and 1660s towards the Dutch collegians, particularly in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. English Quakers at home and abroad, and emergent artistic and scientific societies that met in pubs and coffee houses, good places, all operating autonomously with incipient critiques of extant institutions. The book reconstructs a vibrant political world that Milton and Spinoza shared. Leo is also at work on a study of the international anti-psychiatry movement between the 1930s and the 1980s, examining how and why diverse figures took issue with institutional psychiatric practices, as well as the psychoanalytic establishment, as well as their relationships to neoliberal politics and subjectivation, particularly with reference to labor, authority, and management. Please welcome Russ with a round of applause. Thank you.
All right, is that working? Yes, good. All right. So I want to begin by joining the chorus of voices here celebrating Steve Fallon. Before we actually met in person, his work was profoundly important and influential, even decisive in turning me to early modern studies. And I'm not exaggerating or being unnecessarily humble when I say that I consider much of my work to be adding footnotes to Milton Among the Philosophers and Milton's Peculiar Grace. Absolutely indispensable works, rare in that they do nothing less than set an agenda for Milton studies and early modern studies at large. And I should say I often recommend them to scholars of Spinoza and Spinozism to learn like how you actually study monism and why it matters. And I feel like Steve's particularly exemplary on that. And after meeting Steve, it became clear to me that he's not merely a rare, exemplary writer and thinker, but an exemplary person. Generous, brilliant, enthusiastic, and kind. Everybody I know who knows Steve testifies to this, to his support and sincerity. And it's a great honor to be asked to be here today. And it's with immense joy that I get to celebrate your work and influence. And if my grandma asks, I don't need to lie. I came to Notre Dame today to venerate a saint. So how do we account for the history of philosophy? My current book manuscript, Invisible Colleges, begins with the study of a philosophy that is situated, that involves not only abstracted ideas and their reception, but also the kinds of mundane yet crucial questions that we deal with every time we schedule a seminar, a working group meeting, a coffee with a colleague to discuss shared interests. When and where do we meet? Who participates? What are the rules, implicit or explicit, for the meeting? What texts do we discuss? What education or experience do you need to participate? How do we share resources and make our work available to each other? These are especially crucial questions for the figures I'm interested in. Quakers, Collegians, Mennonites, Remonstrants, that is to say Arminians, Cambridge Platonists, Leafhebbers, and amateurs in the latter half of the 17th century, only a few of whom maintained any official relationship with an established church or university. We perhaps take for granted that our efforts are underwritten and supported by universities. There's an administrative apparatus that handles many of the details and which legitimates our activities. But the early modern figures to whom I turn in this book work deliberately at the margins of such institutions. Take, for instance, Baruch Spinoza, who refused a position at the University of Heidelberg in 1673 in order to retain what he called his libertas philosophandi, that is, his freedom to philosophize, who produced or co-produced a series of texts during his lifetime to teach his friends in smaller working groups outside of the ambit of any university, church, or synagogue, who maintains a network of interlocutors with idiosyncratic educations, many of whom were autodidacts with remarkably different assumptions and resources than their contemporaries who were affiliated with universities, consistories, or established pedagogical bodies. We know, for instance, that Spinoza shared work with collegians, more on them anon. Really, a discussion group that gathered regularly in various meetings or colleges across Holland, an alternative to congregational meetings, involving men and women autodidacts who nevertheless laid claim to philosophy and theology beyond the usual institutional approaches to both. One of the chief claims of this project is that Milton and Spinoza share milieu across the 1660s and 70s. This milieu is one defined in part by the emergent international influence of the Quakers. Figures like George Keith and Thomas Elwood, for instance, Quakers who were active during this formative period, were part of a transnational movement to wrest authority from abiding religious institutions. The Quakers were, for the most part, autodidacts, advancing an intellectual agenda that was largely at odds with Oxford and Cambridge and the various churches and congregations throughout England. Less known, though, is the impact that Quakers made among the Mennonites and Collegians in Amsterdam and Rotterdam across the 1650s and 60s. That is, precisely when Spinoza and his interlocutors were attending collegiate meetings. Works like the Tractatus Theologico Politicus and the Ethics, to say nothing of Spinoza's Korte Verhandeling or short treatise, should be read directly in relation to Quaker texts in English and Dutch. But what is more compelling, perhaps, is that the collegians and Quakers shared material resources. They met at the same places, at the same times, and discussed the same texts. The collegiate approaches to pedagogy and reason are often deliberately pitched against their often difficult to deal with Quaker opponents. They translate the same texts. For instance, the Quaker George Keith and Spinoza's friend Johannes Bouwmeester both translate into English and Dutch, respectively, Ibn Tufayle's 12th century philosophical fiction, The High Ibn Yaqta, a work that was available in an influential Latin edition in 1671 with the title Philosophus Autodidactus. And Tim's the guy to ask about that. He knows that, in and out. I've learned a lot from him on this. So they were related, they being here Keith and Bouwmeester, in varying degrees to the mid-century Hartlibian preoccupation with universal reformation and pan-sophism. But they lived too late in the 17th century to entertain any fictions that universal reformation or great instauration would be taken up by established churches or universities, to say nothing of the provincial or national governments in England, Ireland, the Dutch Republic, France, or the Atlantic world at large. They also deliberately described their intellectual lives including their approaches to knowledge and pedagogy in terms of friendship. In many ways, the works of Quakers, collegians, Mennonites, and even prominent members of the Spinoza circle, even Spinoza himself, might be described as minor variations on the Erasmian adage, friends hold all things in common, which, if you go through, this is rarely done, but if you go and read Spinoza's Ethics with an eye to the adages, they show up everywhere. Pedagogy and philosophy are matters here between friends. So as I prepared this talk, however, it occurred to me that much of what is at stake here in Invisible College, much of what's at stake in Milton and Spinoza's approaches to friendship, pedagogy, collectivity, and autodidacticism are rooted in their idiosyncratic approaches to Christianity. And so, on our way to autodidacticism and the refusal of dominion, what I will do for the talk this afternoon is think about what for Milton or Spinoza is a church or an assembly. Where does pedagogy happen? Let me go back first to the preface to the 1677 Opera Posthuma, where the writers Yarich Yallis and Lodewijk Meyer frame Spinoza's as a Christian philosophy. Now let me be clear, I'm not making a case today for Spinoza's Christianity, historically or intellectually. I don't have a horse in that race. People can argue that. I imagine nobody here wants to argue that in the courtyard, but you can. But I don't need to make that case. His closest friends and posthumous editors make that case for me. Which brings us to Yarich Yallis. Yallis wrote it, I'll get it. Yarich Yallis, a Mennonite and collegian who wrote the preface to Spinoza's Opera Posthuma. Now, contemporary scholars often neglect this work. It's never been translated into English before, and it's been reprinted infrequently since the end of the 17th century. In the preface, Yallis, who had been friends with Spinoza since the mid-1650s, when they met at the Amsterdam Exchange, both participating in the world of kind of speculation as well as just dealing in grocery goods. He offers a biography of Spinoza, presses the contents of the volume, and, most remarkably, and for modern audiences counterintuitively, he demonstrates how Spinoza's philosophy agrees point by point with Christianity. But it's a rational, minimal Christianity, unaffiliated with any visible church, the sort of intellectual Christianity promoted by the collegians in the interests of agreement and mutual tolerance. Now, certainly, from a modern perspective, Yallis's preface is an inadequate and a strange introduction to Spinoza and his thought, emphasizing the philosopher's agreement with Christianity. It eschews any references whatsoever to the author's initial Judaism or to the Jewish community in Amsterdam. It opts instead to present Spinoza as a de facto Christian, but only insofar as Christianity is a rational religion that is irreducible to Scripture or any extant church or sect. Moreover, while the preface is riddled with references to Scripture, in the margins, as well as in the text itself, these references are only meant to confirm what's evident in nature and commended by reason. Scripture, in other words, is not a source. It's a derivative body of work that seals or corroborates what Spinoza demonstrates in the Ethics. Put another way, Yallis's interpretation of Spinoza's work is remarkably similar to Milton's vision of Christianity in De Doctrina Christiana, oriented as it is around Matthew 22 and what Milton calls spiritual understanding. Yallis, however, I can talk about in the Q&A, that's a different paper. Yallis devotes most of the preface to explaining that Spinoza's philosophy does not contradict Christianity, but in fact corresponds to its purest, most philosophical form. So perhaps I'm, assuming too much about Yarich Yallis. Who is he? Known to Spinoza scholars, but even then marginally, neither he nor the collegiate movement are generally studied by Miltonists. Yallis was born into a family of Frisian descent who settled in Amsterdam in the early 17th century. He was baptized in the Flemish Mennonite community that met at the Church of the Lam, or known as the Lamists, in Amsterdam in 1641. This is usual for men of 20 or 21 years old in that congregation. In his early adulthood, He worked as a grocer, running a shop, as well as a wholesale business from his house to Hoop Obit Water. And as Stephen Nadler affirms, he frequently did business with the Portuguese Jews and may have been a customer of Spinoza's family firm. And it's really important to say, many of Spinoza's strongest friendships take shape around the market area, around the stock exchange, even to the point that what it means for some of his friends to be a friend is they support him late into life. They pay his bills. The lens grinding you hear so much about is actually a side hustle, as the students would say. Like that's Spinoza's literally on his grind set, right? He's making his money and paying his bills because he's being supported by friends who are still working in the grocery trade. Anyway, it's also very likely that Spinoza met Jellis at the Amsterdam Exchange in the early 1650s, along with the merchants Peter Balling and Simon Joost de Vries, the publisher and bookseller Jan Wieverts, and the prolific transmaker Jan Hendricks Glasmacher. They shared an abiding interest in philosophy, particularly Cartesian philosophy, and they met regularly to discuss it. The friends, all of whom were Mennonites, except for Spinoza, were also collegians, attending the regular meetings or colleges in Amsterdam to pray, sing hymns, read and discuss scripture, and promote a rational Christianity without clerical authorities, superstitious rites, or exclusive confessions. Spinoza may have joined his comrades at the gatherings of the Amsterdam collegians in the mid-1650s, often held in Wieverts' house or bookshop. At the very least, they met among themselves regularly to discuss philosophy in meetings that were very similar to the collegiate sessions. Now, while Spinoza left Amsterdam in the summer of 1661, he remained in contact with this circle of friends, interlocutors who read his writing carefully, including early drafts of material from the Ethics, and posed him questions and asked for clarification by letter. Based on his appreciation for Spinoza's work, Jellis even funded the publication of the philosopher's geometric presentation of Descartes' Principles of Philosophy in both Latin and Dutch. So not only are they paying for him to work, they're paying for his work to appear in print. All of those that survived Spinoza from this circle of friends, to a person, namely Jellis, Glasmacher, and Wieverts, played significant roles in the publication of his posthumous works. This is another way of, I think, thinking at the level of materialism, the meaning of the oft-quoted phrase from Spinoza, a free man thinks least of all of death. You have friends, that's part of the freedom, and they publish you after that. Although he had no formal philosophical education and had never attended a university, Jellis committed himself to enlightenment, religious and philosophical, working outside of the more conventional scholarly institutions of the period, from the universities to the respectable intellectual circles comprised of city regents and men of letters. Jellis frequently corresponded with Spinoza, posing questions about his philosophy and seeking advice about his own work. For instance, Jellis sent a draft of his Confession of the Universal and Christian Faith to Spinoza in 1673, soliciting the philosopher's opinion. And Jellis and Spinoza alike apparently agreed that Christianity was a rational religion, yielding real insight into nature and ethics, but only insofar as it promoted intellectual love of God and love of one's neighbor. So this is of great practical importance to Jellis and Spinoza, and it informs their shared notion of a church. Now, I said earlier that both Jellis's Confession and his introduction to Spinoza's Opera Postuma are collegiate works. That is to say, they reflect their extensive participation in the regular colleges in Amsterdam. Gatherings at which participants discussed scripture openly in Dutch, in the absence of any preachers or official expositors, in an effort to discover that minimal, non-hierarchical, non-denominational Christianity. And really, it strikes me too that this comes directly out of the Arminian movement and like the collapse of institutional Arminianism after the Synod of Dort. So in many ways, this is another point of real contact between what these figures are doing in the 1660s and 70s and what Milton is doing in that same time. It's in part what it means to be an Arminian institutionally. It means you're going to lack resources within any institutional church. You have to kind of make it up as you go along. And that's where the collegians come from. At the heart of collegiatism, we find the conviction that every man and woman has a fundamental freedom to speak or prophecy on scripture and religion, a principle grounded in Paul's comments on prophecy at 1 Corinthians 14. All may gather, moreover, to read and debate such matters without any presiding preacher, priest, or authority. Emphasizing and encouraging debate and not operating under the aegis of any particular confession or congregation, collegians minimized otherwise divisive differences of doctrine and opinion. Indeed, collegians affirmed that minimal Christianity and sought basic principles on which diverse participants might agree, relegating most of what passed as crucial elements of Christianity, dogma, sacraments, ceremonies, and the accidents of confession, to the status of adiaphora as matters of indifference. Most agreed that what was required for salvation was not exclusive to any single confession. Many collegians did not recognize any visible church, nor did they believe that salvation was limited to Christians. The practice of tolerance, in turn, was mutual, not a privilege administered by a magistrate or church authority, but rather a duty shared among equals who met in search of common ground, an expression of their egalitarian convictions about prophecy and authority. As such, the colleges drew participants from across congregations, confessions, professions, and walks of life. Remonstrants, I'm really excited about remonstrants. Remonstrants, that is to say Arminians, Mennonites, Socinians, Quakers, Jews, Millenarians, Philo-Judaists, mystics, spiritualists, rationalists, clerics as well as laymen, the university-educated as well as autodidacts, recent immigrants and strangers, as well as men and women from ancient Dutch families, merchants, physicians, pharmacists, artists, an array of people that reflected the complexity and diversity of civic life in the 17th century Dutch Republic. And this is especially true of the colleges in Amsterdam, where a man like Jellis, a pious intellectual, certainly, but also a grocer without a university education, clerical training, or fluency in Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, could participate in important debates on reason and scripture. Another way of thinking of the collegiate movement is like, if you read Perkins's Art of Prophesying, remarkably liberally, like in a way that Perkins himself would have flipped out about, like you get the collegians. The first college in Amsterdam was convened in 1646, and early members included Mennonites and Remonstrants, as well as various unaffiliated participants. Some members enjoyed international reputations. Theologians like Adam Moreel and Daniel de Breen, for instance, both of whom played principal roles in the establishing of college meetings in Amsterdam. So some members enjoyed international reputations, but most participants did not. Jellis may have been present at collegiate meetings before the end of the 1640s. But from the outset, Mennonites like Jellis comprised the majority of collegians in Amsterdam, and prominent members of his own Lamist congregation, especially Galenus Abraham Stahan, were drawn to the gatherings. Jellis was certainly attending them in the early 1650s, as Galenus emerged as the principal figure among the Amsterdam collegians. And the Lamist congregation, in turn, was sundered by a fiery and contentious debates over collegiatism, particularly after Galenus suggested in 1655 that the colleges could meet regularly at the Lamb Church itself, the prospect of which alienated many members of the congregation. Jellis would have been intimately familiar with these discussions, which pitted the collegiate notion, I'm too loud. Sorry, okay, I just want to make sure. Pitted the collegiate notion of a non-hierarchical and universal Christianity against, in this case, the Mennonite commitment to the integrity of one particular congregation. And there are direct connections here, and this is where this utopian view of the collegians I've given so far actually comes apart. The test case is, what do they do when Quakers start showing up to their meetings? So there are direct connections between the English Quakers abroad in the Netherlands and the history of the collegiate movement. Jellis himself was acutely aware of the decisive conversations between collegians and Quakers, debates that played a crucial role in the transformation of collegiatism in Amsterdam, in particular, across the late 1650s and 60s. As the movement drifted towards rationalism and away from its initial willingness to dabble in spiritualism and mysticism. While collegians initially found common ground with the Quakers, it soon became clear that Quaker interpretations of reason and inner light were incommensurable with what we find in Yellis's rationalist accounts of certainty and salvation, informed by his encounters with Cartesianism, as well as his discussions of Spinoza's work, to say nothing of his conversations with Spinoza himself. To Yellis and many of his fellow collegians, Quakers were misguided mystics for whom reason remained tethered to revelation and an anarchic spiritualist interpretation of inner light, not an expression of enlightenment, but rather enthusiasm. Along with Balling, who contested Quaker spiritualism in his own 1662 treatise, The Light on the Candlestick, or Het Licht op den Kandelaar, Yellis affirmed that clear and distinct ideas were far more integral to spiritual understanding, and thus to salvation, than inspiration or any other subjective experience of revelation. That is to say, Yellis and the collegians' interest in Cartesianism was not at all disconnected from the debates with Quakers at the colleges in Amsterdam. In fact, Descartes' careful reflections on nature, intellection, certainty, and the passions afforded Yellis and his fellow collegians precise resources, enabling them to distinguish themselves from the Quakers. The rational turn among Amsterdam collegians, and that is to say, the influence of the Amsterdam collegians on Spinoza himself, is a direct response to the challenge of Quakerism, and in particular, to Quakers who attended collegiate meetings. At first, again, they were welcomed, but after fundamental disagreements emerged on sources as well as the meanings of certain key terms, their efforts were taken to expunge them. So the rational turn among Amsterdam collegians should be considered apropos of the Quakers, as well as the increasing influence of Socinianism, integral to the development of collegiatism in Amsterdam across the 1650s and 60s. That's often taken into account, the challenge of the Socinians. The problem, and especially after Naylor in England, is that those things become, for civic authorities in Amsterdam, indistinguishable. Socinians, a certain kind of anti-Trinitarian, and Quaker. So many collegians might have been sympathetic to Socinianism or Quakerism at first, but they were wary of any association with anti-Trinitarianism, especially after the States General explicitly banned the printing, circulation, or teaching of Socinianism in 1653. Cartesianism may have offered a safer alternative to much more controversial anti-Trinitarian interpretations of reason and revelation, particularly as Socinianism and Quakerism became watchwords for atheism and heresy rather than any particular theology. If Elsevier had indeed agreed to print Milton's De Doctrina Christiana in the Netherlands in the 1670s, its publication would have been stopped and those behind it prosecuted on precisely these grounds, precisely the grounds that the collegians are trying to avoid in their kind of flight from the Quakers. So Yellis's aim in the Spinoza preface is also to show that Christ and the apostles teach exactly what reason prescribes. Reason dictates that those who truly understand God necessarily demonstrate friendship and honor, as well as steadfast honesty, paraphrasing Spinoza here. They eschew anger, hatred, envy, and pride, and realize strength of character, or in the Dutch, vroomheid. They are thankful to one another, dankbaar tegen malkander zijn. Men who live according to reason are bound to agree in nature and to desire the best for each other. Moreover, they are compelled by reason to repay even hate with love. Yellis immediately posits that, insofar as reason dictates that knowing God is our greatest virtue, so too does this knowledge of God afford mankind true freedom and true joy. Citing key propositions from the ethics, he claims that an intellectual knowledge of God enables us to overcome evil affects, thus affording us the greatest satisfaction of mind there can be, as well as the eternal love of God. Nothing less than, quote, our highest salvation or blessedness or freedom. Thus, it's by way of the ethics that Yellis arrives at the conclusion that we must love God above all and our neighbors as ourselves. That is, because we acquire the eternal love of God through intellectual knowledge, and those who have acquired intellectual knowledge of God strive for friendship and love for others. It's only then that Yellis invokes Christ and the apostles to underline that their teachings conform with reason. Now, with Yellis's collegiate Spinoza in mind, even this, I hope, adequate sketch, let's consider Milton's own minimal Christianity in practice. What does Milton think a church is? And what does one do there, alone or with others? De Doctrina Christiana is remarkably instructive here, given a clear sense of how Milton, towards the end of the 1650s and into the Restoration period, answered these questions. The universal visible church, he claims, is simply the assembly of the called. A particular church, any assembly of the faithful, or more specifically, a society of those who profess the faith, joined together by a special bond of brotherhood, a society ideally suited to maintaining the mutual upbuilding and fellowship of the saints. Milton emphasizes autonomy at every turn, autonomy for each particular church. Again, he demands comparison here with his remonstrant or Arminian contemporary, Gerard de Brandt, who writes a whole history of the Reformation with this in mind. Any particular church can effectively govern itself. There's no unifying liturgy. In fact, there's no need for liturgy at all. Milton even suggests that the Lord's Prayer is a teaching aid that may be said to, if useful, but it's not necessary. Nor are the sacraments, he admits, absolutely necessary. There is little attention to the practical administration of sacraments in his account of particular churches, simply because the criteria for administration or preparation is so minimal. When they are administered, Milton is clear that, since Christ is, quote, the unique priest of the New Testament, there is therefore no order of humankind which can rightly claim for itself before others this function of giving and dispensing the sacred things, since in Christ we are all equal priests. Or, as he says elsewhere, any faithful people whatever can be ordinary ministers. Deacons and presbyters are chosen by the people from their own population. Their chief functions include teaching and discipline. And discipline itself does not reside in any body. Milton is also clear that no visible church, let alone any magistrate, has any right to impose its own interpretations on people's consciences as legal requirements. But so too must internal coercion be absent. These assemblies of the faithful, after all, promote and realize spiritual understanding that is incompatible with coercion. In his account of particular churches, Milton gives us something like a precis for autodidacticism. So I hope the similarities between the collegians and Milton's assemblies of the faithful are becoming clear. Their form are non-hierarchical and depend alike on comparable interpretations of Paul's account of prophecy. The right and ability of public interpretation is distributed across the assembly. One major divider, though, women's speaking. While there are a few studies that examine to the status of women in collegiate communities, Wiep van Boom affirms that collegiate egalitarian practices did indeed extend to women. We know that women were integral to the collegiate movement, and they seem to have been allowed to prophesy in meetings. Indeed, Jaarg Jellis' own sister, Brechtje, actually hosted crucial meetings between Amsterdam Mennonites and Quakers, perhaps even Margaret Fell at her house. Milton, in turn, specifies that women are commanded to say nothing in church. We could even say that, and this is precisely the period where the histories of Quakerism are being built around key women. In the Netherlands, Judith Zinspenning, and Fell herself in England. In a passage that would undoubtedly have resonated with collegiates, though, Milton makes it clear that the assembly of the faithful is not structured according to custom or culture, and certainly not by any magistrate or authority. On the contrary, the apostolic church was autonomous and spontaneous. And I'm moving toward my conclusion here. This is Milton's quote. The custom of holding meetings should not be retained in accordance with modern usage, but be restored in accordance with the apostles' practices. There, a single person, and a hireling at that, did not arrogate the exclusive right of making pronouncements ex cathedra, but each one of the faithful, according to his given talents, took his turn speaking, prophesying, teaching, and exhorting, and even all the weakest took turns in questioning and consulting the older and the more learned. Once again, disagreements are not mediated by any authority beyond or above the assembly. Love of neighbor is integral to an assembly's comportment to disagreement, especially since no particular church is perfect or completely glorified. If there be disagreement amongst the seemingly faithful about the sense of Scripture, Milton says, their duty will be to tolerate one another until God shall reveal it to all what is true. The duty or obligation is spontaneous, not coerced, related directly to the intellectual love of God and to an abiding commitment and love for one's neighbor. This is the criteria for recognizing a visible church and for the constitution of an assembly of the faithful. These minimal practices, related as they are to Christ's announcement at Matthew 22, are all that necessarily pertain to Milton's notion of a particular church. So let me end here with a brief speculative fiction. Milton's De Doctrina Christiana, let's say it's printed by Elsevier in the late 1670s, and it circulates among the collegians at Amsterdam and even Rotterdam. For those who could read Latin, it seems like a Socinian work, not unlike texts by Faustus Socinus, Johann Krell, and Johann Ludwig von Wolzocher, that had been available in the growing Bibliotheca Fratrum Polinorum since the 1660s. These folks were quite used to finding common ground with the Socinians and developed their own ways of managing the injunctions of the States General against disseminating and discussing anti-Trinitarian ideas. The Milton of the De Doctrina Christiana, moreover, is in key ways distinct enough from the more familiar Milton of the Latin defenses to warrant a fresh read. I can talk about that later if you want. There are relatively few who remember the controversies of the late 1640s and early 1650s, active in the 1670s. So Milton's De Doctrina Christiana is also greeted by Mennonites and collegians like Yellis, and even some remonstrants, as a thoughtful work germane to their egalitarian convictions about prophecy and authority. Key aspects of Milton's De Doctrina Christiana are even harmonized with Yellis's Spinoza, the Spinoza of the preface to the Opera Posthuma, chiefly his reflection on particular churches. After all, Milton and the collegians, to say nothing of Spinoza himself, share the same minimal criteria for both assembly and salvation, and they share a transformative interpretation of Matthew 22. Theirs are practical pieties and philosophical agendas set to work by the intellectual love of God and the spontaneous and deliberate love of one's neighbor. Thanks.
So while our speakers take their seats, I'll be introducing our respondent. Is that right? Yeah. Achsah Guibbory is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of English at Barnard, where she teaches Milton, Donne, and 17th century literature and nation formation, and Christian/Jewish relations and religious identities in the early modern period. Her books include Ceremony and Community from Herbert to Milton, Returning to John Donne, and Christian Identity, Jews and Israel in 17th century England, which won the John T. Shawcross Award from the Milton Society of America, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters on 17th century literature and culture. She has been an NEH Fellow and a Guggenheim Fellow. Achsah holds an honorary doctorate of Humane Letters from Iona College. The Milton Society of America named her Honored Milton Scholar in 2018. Professor Guibbory has served as president of both the Milton Society of America and the John Donne Society. On her previous publications, she currently is extending her exploration of Christian-Jewish relations and religious identity into the 20th century and working on a book titled Exceptionalism, a historical and literary perspective from the Bible to the present.
So you prompted everybody I have a loud voice, but I'll stop it on. If it's too loud, just please tell me. Okay. First of all, thank you, Steve, for, is this working? Thank you, Steve, for inviting me and for everything that you have done. We have been friends going back to the Newberry Library, Milton, from the very beginning of time. And there are just so many great memories I have of times that I've shared with you, friendship and scotch, many walks, many conferences, and your amazing work. Anyhow, it is an incredible privilege to be here today, to be able to celebrate you. And hopefully you're going to continue on. We'll continue celebrating you a long time. So, these papers are a wonderful tribute to Steve Fallon, and they show his profound influence on Milton's studies, his groundbreaking books on Milton and among the philosophers, and Milton's peculiar grace. And I remember hearing the first paper you gave, I believe, at one of the Milton symposiums. It was, I think, the beginning of it, the start of it. I think, he's right, he's right, he's right. So anyhow, it stays in my mind, and it comes up in all the papers in one way or another today. Okay, Milton is complex with contradictory impulses. He's a monist, except when he's not. For example, the descriptions of Eve identifying her with an unruly nature that needs to be controlled, while Adam is stronger in reason, though he succumbs quickly. Milton is the voice of religious toleration, except when he's thinking about Catholics or Jews. He is an Arminian, except when he's sort of a Calvinist. So that's one of the reasons why he is so interesting to all of us, I think. All three speakers are preoccupied with Milton's theology as well as with philosophy. John Rumrich makes us feel the darkness, the weight of the responsibility of being an autonomous and responsible moral agent. As he describes the crushing, paralyzing, eternal weight of glory, he reminds us how hard it is to be a moral, upright person in our world as well as the world of Milton's poem. But then there's another weight that we feel in the poem that comes from the sense that avoiding the fall, making bad choices, was not wholly in Adam and Eve's control. For all God's and Milton's emphasis on their free will, there is a sense of inevitability that leads John to compare Paradise Lost to film noir, which I think is actually a wonderful comparison, with its overriding gloom and darkness as things drive on to their end. The tension between God's insistence on free will, human free will, and aspects of the poem that make it seem as if all has been determined, suggests that God cannot be justified. Okay, in my opinion. It also fits with my students' response to the epic. No matter how much I try to justify Milton, maybe I'm not successful, because maybe Milton isn't. The Arminian Milton must be theologically committed, and here I'm just summarizing what she said, theologically committed to indeterminacy. God cannot control what will happen, but God's omnipotence leads him to give us free will, requiring him to restrain himself from interfering even though he knows what will happen. I always think about what it was being a parent of a 16-year-old. And that's how I explain it to my students about, yeah, you can foresee it, but you can't really stop. You know what they're doing. Okay, Milton reminds readers at the pivotal moments that things, and this is from John, wonderful quotation. Milton reminds readers at pivotal moments that things could happen otherwise than they do, even though from God's eternal perspective, they unfold precisely as he has foreseen they will. It's a great statement. For Milton, we have to have freedom. God cannot interfere with Adam and Eve's autonomy. And yet, a sense of determinism pervades the entire poem. And not just because we know the end of the story. John insists it's not really Calvinist determinism, but I'm not sure. The determinism of Calvin's predestination has simply relocated, finding a new home in what John astutely calls God's omniscient authority over all that occurs. He shows us this in his fine reading of the account of Eve's dream, where Satan, not actually free, but a tool of God, and I love that, tool of God, enters, tool, it's almost phallic though, wait a minute, enters into the very person of Eve, through her ear, into her vulnerable and unguarded sleeping mind. The omniscient but curiously passive God allows the rape. Eve cannot prevent this happening. She has no more control over the dream than a victim of rape, and she's sleeping. John's emphasis on the power of God's omniscient authority, and I hadn't really thought about it this way, and the power of his omniscient authority reminds me of Freud's concept of the omnipotence of thought. Omnipotence of thought is magical thinking. The notion that one's thinking makes things happen, that you influence the world by your thoughts. Freud said it's characteristic of infants, the narcissistic stage, or primitive peoples, but that religion eventually takes its place. But what if that's what's going on in Paradise Lost? Then it's gone back into religion. So it returns in Paradise Lost, where God is a character whose traditional omnipotence is self-limited, its power replaced by a powerful omniscience, a seeing thinking that limits the free will of supposedly autonomous agents. Foreseeing the fall of Adam and Eve and having created them with their particular weaknesses, I think he bears some responsibility for their fall, even as they make their own choice. And so Milton leaves us wondering, how much control do we really have over our future? That's dark indeed, John. Seriously so. Okay, Sam Fallon's paper, Samson's Ransom, reassesses not only Milton's poem, but also Manoah, who critics have not viewed sympathetically, as he says, hoping to ransom his son with money and promising to build a material monument. Manoah has been seen as ignorant, limited, attuned to the body rather than the spirit, thus representing what Augustine called carnal Israel, as opposed to Christian, the spiritual Israel. Samson's physical strength supposedly contrasts with the spiritual power of, say, the sun in Paradise Regained. Sam's reading of the poem is generous, emphasizing the humanity of Manoah in a way that redeems him. You've ransomed him. I'm serious. When I'm reading this, I'm thinking, that's the most positive reading of Manoah that I've ever seen. And I think you're right. Noting that both of Milton's 1671 poems end with the son's homecoming, and that Milton expands Manoah's role in Judges, Fallon explores the son-father relation, focusing not on the heavenly home, but the human one. He's a wonderful writer, and his argument is tight, elegant, and eloquent. Human and theological concerns are interwoven, for there are two fathers, Manoah, who is always loving, and God, who Samson feels has abandoned him. I was his nursling once, as he laments. Sam Fallon's reading of the scenes involving Manoah and Samson bring out how touching they are, with a father whose love is so single-minded that even the claims of Samson's divine calling cannot distract or deter it, unquote. Manoah and we observe what Fallon calls the pain of paternal love. I could say paternal love too, just to add that in. Something we never see God feeling, I would add, in Milton's poems. Think about it. Do we ever see God feeling that kind of love? I don't think so. Okay, Manoah and we observe, no, I said, okay. When Manoah visits his son in prison and laments, who would not be father now? Who would now be a father in my stead? I hear Ben Jonson in his poem about the death of his son. Oh, could I lose all father now? As Fallon puts it, The curious effect of Milton's insertion of Manoah is to put a representation of choicest love at the center of a tragedy of divine election. That's another wonderful statement. In both John's and Sam's papers, God has a dark side from a human point of view, and that is all we have. Here it is God, the divine Father, who may not choose you or can reject you after he's chosen you. Chosenness is precarious. It's an unstable state. The earthly Father, with his unconditional love, his dependability, as opposed to a God who changes his mind, seems preferable to me, though not all fathers live up to that ideal. No wonder Milton has to keep returning to the project of justification. Sam Fallon explains why Manoah's offer to take his son home by ransoming him would release Samson from his vocation. This gives new meaning to Samson's attempt to ransom his son, and we sense what a burden it is to have a divine vocation. And here we're back at the rate that John Rumrich is talking about. Yet to give up that vocation is to give up a sense of being chosen, recognized as special. And here we are at the theological problem. The struggle and tensions in Milton's Arminian soteriology that Steve Fallon has also defined before us better than ever in Milton's Peculiar Grace. Sam Fallon's paper is one of the best, most humane and psychologically insightful readings, I think, that we have of Samson Agonistes. In part because he comes heretically close to suggesting that maybe we would rather have the unconditional love of a dependable father or mother or spouse than live with the uncertainty of an unknowable divine father, a Calvinist God that can choose you, leave you alone, reject you, and that could take back that election. It all depends on whether what you really want is glory, to be exceptional in more than one person's eyes. I found this paper written by his son, presented at a conference honoring his father, incredibly moving. And it spoke to me in my own life, and I bet I'm not alone. Unconditional love may be the best, the highest form of love, but it doesn't confer the privilege of having been chosen, which is what Milton wanted. Do we, or maybe, don't we really want to have it all? Yeah, all. We don't want to have to choose. Okay, Russ Leo. This is a great paper and a great project. I just wish I'd had it to be able to read, and so therefore I can't properly respond to it, but I gotta say, you've gotta get this book out because I've gotta read it, otherwise I'm not gonna get to see it, so. But seriously, it's just wonderful. It's just absolutely great work of putting together things. I'd never heard of the collegians until the Canada seminar, never heard of them. Although I knew a lot about Spinoza and about Milton, but this is a really great project. So since I couldn't read it, I did make one or two little comments, and I wanted you to say some things about Spinoza myself. I'm not an expert on the ethics, but I know a lot about the other part, the theological political treatise. I think I'm the only person at Barnard who has ever taught that. And I teach it every time I teach the Enlightenment course that's probably going to get canceled. Not by students, no, they like that. Anyhow, I just want to say a couple things. Two little tiny things about your paper. No, I guess I can't find one. Well, I'll just go ahead and they'll come in. Okay. A couple things about Spinoza. His Spinoza audience. Oh, yeah, the one thing is that Yellows, if that's the way you say it, is really making him into a Christian. That is his project. And so that's not necessarily to say, which some people do, that Spinoza was a Christian. I don't think he wasn't anything. I don't think he embraced anything. And the other thing in relation to that, too, is the whole argument for a rational religion, that Christianity is a rational religion. It's part of something that happens. John Toland also argues for it in Locke and everything. And the implication is that Judaism and Jews are not rational, okay? So I just kind of want to put that out there because when a person makes that argument, there's also the kind of, it could be used that way, and then you get the Jewish Enlightenment and Mendelssohn, whose son then decides not to be a Jew because of, the burden of that. But I just sort of wanted to put that little tiny, notation. That's not your subject, but I just wanted to kind of bring that in. Okay, so, but his audience for the theological political treatise was Christian, and that's 1670. Christians who could read Latin. Jews were prohibited to have contact with him or to read his writings. And his primary goal was to argue for toleration in the Netherlands, where he saw men, and my quotations will all be from the treatise, professing the Christian religion, quarrel so fiercely and display the bitterest hatred towards one another. And it's a point that Voltaire would again make in Candide. He sought in TTP, which I'll call it, to find the common denominator that could bring Christians together and encourage toleration of belief, but that might also diminish the difference between Christians and Jews, although that wasn't his primary emphasis. That could be, in fact, the effect if one read that, because you're trying to find what is it that the Old Testament and the New Testament have in common. He wants the thing that if everybody could agree about the same kind of thing, we wouldn't kill each other. It's a lesson for now. Okay, so the essence of Scripture, Spinoza said, is, and this is in the Matthew thing, okay, to love God as above all, and one's neighbor as oneself, to uphold justice, and it's quotations from chapter 12, to help the helpless, and especially the doctrine of charity, which is everywhere commended in the highest degree in both Testaments. This emphasis so often is on both Testaments, both Testaments. The teaching is not only in Matthew 22, thou shalt love your neighbor as thyself, but also in Leviticus 19, the center of the book of holiness of all those awful little rules. So, it's a really interesting thing. That's why he picks that out, because it is something common to both Testaments. I would say, since this comes up often, it all depends on what do you consider your neighbor, okay? Because your neighbor might be only those who are kind of like you. So, as a learned Jew, Spinoza knew well that in the Talmud, the law of love is extended beyond one's neighbor by one rabbi. Rabbi Hillel taught, and this is the quotation, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto another. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. I'm not saying he's a Jew, I'm just saying he knew this was there in both of them, and that there was the potentiality for expanding something beyond neighbors. We're now, in every country now, we have this whole question, who counts as your neighbor? And particularly in America, there's so many people who are not supposed to count as your neighbor because they're not us. So Spinoza, I think, is so aware of this, and that's what he really wants. He insisted that not only is the obedience, this is the only obedience God demands. And I will just add, my friend Abdul Al-Jabbar, who's my Muslim friend, he rented my house for 4 years. He told me when I saw him last summer that, he said, in Islam, and the tradition is that the person who helps other people will get into heaven before the person who prays daily at the mosque. And I just love that. And so for me, one of Spinoza's greatest contributions is laying a foundation, not just for toleration among Christians, but among all people and all beliefs. Okay, that's it.
Zoom audience. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I enjoyed all three papers very much. My question is to Russ and Leo. In the last few sentences of your paper, you pointed to things that might be the differential specific of Milton's thinking in relation to paradise laws. But you didn't really say that. And I wonder whether you can speculate on something within paradise laws that corresponds, I mean, what you did in recreating a whole world is extraordinary. But can you bring that as an impingement on Paradise Lost and show us where something changes in our understanding of Paradise Lost as a result of recreating this world?
In Paradise Lost, yeah.
Yes. Yes, I can. How I would do it is this. I would put Paradise Lost in conversation with the text. Let me get there, just because I have to walk through it. I haven't thought of this, particularly because it's a great question. A text that is remarkably important to all the collegians and even the Dutch-speaking Quakers is Joost van den Vondel has what is a kind of remarkably flexible epic poem about theological doctrine and points. And a section that is frequently excised from that is a particular way of reading the Trinity that's actually, it's also very flexible. You could read it as a fundamental challenge to how you can identify three different kind of figures, or you could read it as perfectly orthodox. Even Vondel writes it, we know, as a Catholic, but it's not read that way. And in much of Jellis's writing in particular, this figures. In fact, that exact section is in his Confession of Faith. I think that helps explain why Paradise Lost gets translated by the later community. Theodor Hock translates it into German, as well as why it's read in a German translation among these same communities. But I think it also, for me, helps understand and helps me reckon with the latter half of the 17th century, how the Whig Milton, like how a generation of people could read Paradise Lost, which is in one sense blatantly anti-Trinitarian, how they could imagine themselves looking askance at that. My sense is it comes out of the way that the collegians, in arguing with the Quakers, figure the Trinity in particular. So the actual doctrine that's at Milton is one point. It helps me understand how they could, what we might easily say, misread, but why the Trinity in Book 3 actually brings together readers rather than sundering an audience. That's one way it helps me at least understand. I know that's a little bit of the dodge because it gets me talking about the Whig Milton. Admittedly, one thing I really struggle with is, like, I don't know, a lot of this Paradise Lost is the text that it's difficult for me to do anything with. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's me because I'm afraid to talk about it, but I'm just going to stick with the 1671 poems. I'm just going to do it. But yeah, but that's my issue. Hopefully that's something like an answer to your question. It's a really great question.
Hi, I have a question for John. I was just thinking about the moment when Satan's flying through chaos and he, hits that vacuity and he starts to sink and sink, and he still could be falling to this very day, except for the fact that this tumultuous cloud happens to generate enough energy to push him off his free fall. I know Joanna Picciotto says that this means that really God just left everything up to chance. I was wondering if you could address that moment in relationship to what you've just been saying about God, that determinants.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. I feel like you gave me a fat pitch, actually. And thank you. Because I do think that the invention of gunpowder in heaven is something that occurs after Satan has fallen, and the other angels are kind of marveling, how did you come up with that? And say, he plays it off as, well, of course, how could you not see it? But I think that that Satan is associated with gunpowder and explosions all through the poem. And I think that there's spooky action at a distance going on with the gunpowder explosion and chaos that occurs and blows him up. I mean, God's fingerprints aren't on it, and they never are, really. But it's that's who he is, and that he becomes his invention. I mean, his engine, right? The engine he invents, the engine in the 17th century refers to ingenuity, or what he comes up with, and that what he does come up with that allows them to come on equal terms against the good angels. I'm going on for perhaps too long, but what goes on against, I mean, the good angels would have clobbered them, right? They're out of it. But Satan comes up with this marvelous invention that sets up the sun on the third day of the battle, and because it neutralizes the good angels' advantage, and then they end up like smacking each other with mountains.
Yes.
So it does seem to me that it's God's script that's playing out, and that the invention of gunpowder is God's inspiration for this fallen being, and that when he comes through chaos, yeah, that's what God wants. He wants him on our planet, you know. So
Gunpowder too, masses of, weapons of mass destruction. I mean, you see how you go down this rabbit hole.
I was thinking, that guy.
Sorry.
No.
Oh, yeah, I'm supposed to stop. Philip, the fellow who wrote, yes, he did write, but the Golden Compass, and they made those films about the Golden. And I saw it on HBO, and I think it's the third season of it, they make a big deal out of oblivion and falling into oblivion, that the father and the mother fall down, and it's this interesting moment. It's actually what Satan is experiencing during the moment of that fall, represented on a TV show, which I was like, whoa, I thought that was wonderful, just as an aside, if you want to watch it, like two people, they're not falling, because if you're falling eternally, it's like Einstein's guy outside the window. He doesn't know he's falling. It's just he's at maximum acceleration. So I do think I think that it's not as I know that's a terrific passage by Joanne, and she says Mr. Chaos. That's like the one gesture that that Milton allows toward, okay, this is the Theodicy. That's it, and I don't even think that's it.
Yeah, thanks. Three terrific papers. I have a comment on Sam's, but not a question. I mean, if I go back in time, I think I would have you sort of write the last chapter of Peculiar Grace and be a co-authored book. So I think that I wish I had any inkling of where you're going with Samson. That was just marvelous.
I just indexed it poorly.
I have a question.
You're a little like the father and the son.
I have a question for John, and it goes back in some ways to Asha's wonderful response. The question of theodicy and what happens. I think you're absolutely right about the Satan's dream and the animal spirits and so forth. I guess the question is theodicy at all possible once you have narrative? I can see theodicy being possible discursively, but once you have narrative, you have to motivate action. We have to somehow get Adam and Eve there. So is this a particular, I used to believe with Danielson that it was a success, and now I come to think it's impossible, and what is your sense of the relation between narrative and the possibility of theology? Of theodicy, excuse me.
Yes, I think that narrative does pose that problem. And I didn't say this, and I meant to say it during the talk, is that I was inspired actually to write this paper around the time that we were working on the collection together, because I loved your contribution. I don't know if you've read it, but Steve takes up the question of the fortune and fall and readdresses this really reverend issue and makes it live again. And I was really impressed with that essay, and it's what made me think, well, I need to go after the theodicy and try and do what you did for the fortune and fall. And I think that's the other side of it, is if you want to justify the ways of God to men, you've got to say, this is just what God wanted. And we are living in a better world despite the suffering, despite the mortality.
have a short question for Sam. And you did such a beautiful job with Manoah. In fact, we just finished the Milton seminar at Loyola, where my students were all in with Manoah and his paternal nature. But there is an analog in these linked works to Home to His Mother's House, Unobserved Return. It's not filial, though. It's Dalilah's invitation to Samson, which is always categorically foreclosed as ridiculous. But is there a way you can then recuperate in a similar way another reviled character?
I mean, I think probably the best version that I've seen is, I don't know if he's published it, but John Rogers in his sort of Yale lectures has a sort of touching reading of Delilah. And I think there is something of the same offer, right? And the response that it provokes is very different, right? Not this sort of retreat into despair, but this sort of violence where he sort of forcibly reacts to her touch. And I guess the thing that I would say further about that is that the Delilah episode, it sort of re-encodes the question of choice, so that it's I chose thee from among my enemies, right? And of course, it's also conditioned by the sense that Manoah does not approve, right? But that he's convinced that Yahweh does approve, right? So it's thoroughly laden with the tensions that I try to describe in talking about Manoah and God. But it's this place where Samson can sort of fantasize about exercising a choice of his own. And in a way that when he does it, sort of looks as brutal as God's does toward him, is what I suppose I would say. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think that's it. Let's give him
I think we have about 15 minutes